The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria is a radical jihadist terror organization, but their strategy and ambitions go far beyond other terror organizations in seeking to create a caliphate based on fundamentalist, ultra-conservative doctrine of Sunni Islam. In the group's own words, to understand them, modern notions of statehood and national borders must be discarded, as improving conditions of the people under their control is less important than the condition of their religion. This aspiration was not a new one. For generations, jihadists had dreamed of establishing caliphate, with Osama bin Laden frequently speaking of it, as him and his affiliates experimented with establishing one in pockets of Iraq and Yemen. Ultimately, the goal was to recreate the original society and caliphate that had ruled in the Middle East during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. The group came into being by exploiting the chaos and divisions within both Syria and Iraq, growing out of what was once Al-Qaeda in Iraq, formed by Sunni militants after the US-led invasion in 2003, and became a major part of the sectarian insurgent forces in the region. In 2011, the group took advantage of the confusion and disorganization following the withdrawal of US troops from Iraq, as well as widespread Sunni anger at the sectarian policies of the increasingly authoritarian Shia-led government in Iraq, to conquer large swathes of land in northern and western Iraq. In 2013, the group also took advantage of the chaotic Syrian civil war, seizing control of territory in Syria and changing their name to reflect this newly gained territory to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, or what is also referred to in the West as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. ISIS is notably different from past terror organizations in their ability to both occupy territory while also raising funds. They wield power through both brutality and bureaucracy. ISIS has clearly learned from past failures in Iraq, with the removal of the Ba'athist government of Saddam Hussein by the US in 2003, and the stripping of the country's civil institutions and barring of government officials from employment produced a power vacuum. As a result, ISIS has built a state that exhibits an extremely efficient and well-organized bureaucracy, and has perpetuated the institutions of government and daily life that allow for society to function, while also using this occupation to raise an unprecedented amount of funds for a terrorist organization. Contrary to popular perceptions that ISIS is dependent on external donors or solely their oil revenues for funding, ISIS at its peak reached into nearly every aspect of the economy in its territory, bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars a year, including but not limited to the sale and refinement of oil, confiscation, looting, extortion, narcotics, taxation, and agriculture. Furthermore, a study by the RAND Corporation, based on captured documents between 2005 and 2010, showed that the group's outside donations only amounted to 5% of the group's operating budget, meaning ISIS was largely self-financed. In 2014, Iraqi intelligence revealed that the organization had assets worth over $2 billion, making it the richest terrorist organization in the world, according to Forbes, and surpassing some small countries' GDP, as well as controlling territory that was at times more expansive than the United Kingdom, with more than 10 million people living under its controlled territory. Thus, ISIS is an incredibly important economic entity to understand. While it doesn't easily lend itself to study, it is vital if the group is to be fully countered and neutralized, as their funding enables further international attacks as has been seen in the past, and leaves behind a blueprint for success for future groups. In terms of sources of revenue, oil is one of the most important, with experts estimating ISIS controlled 60% of oil reserves in Syria at the end of 2014, and had its hand on the 7 major oil and gas reserves in Iraq, including the country's largest oil refinery. This oil is then smuggled into southern Turkey, where it is a prized commodity due to the high price demanded. In mid-2014, a barrel of oil costed approximately $315. In a seemingly conflicting relationship, the Assad regime in Syria also purchases oil from ISIS due to international sanctions against it. In 2015, Forbes magazine estimated oil revenues to be over $3 million every day, amounting to more than $1 billion a year from oil alone. Besides revenue from oil, ISIS sets up and operates an organized war spoils office in each province to calculate the dollar value of loot, tax it, and sell it back to its fighters or those living in occupied territory. This confiscation and looting typically comes from foreigners, the former government, those deemed infidels, or those resisting ISIS's strict rule. An example of this can be found in the Syrian city of Al-Fat, which was looted for antiquities, some dating back 8,000 years, and worth an estimated $63 million. More notably, the central bank of Mosul was plundered for possibly up to $429 million in cash and gold after they captured the city by ISIS. While confiscation and looting seem to exemplify ISIS's chaotic and brutish ways, they have also spent considerable effort in maintaining bureaucratic structures in the interest of revenue raising. For example, 1/5 of the ghanima, or the spoils of war, must be given to the state in a tax known as khums. As well, property taken peacefully, such as that confiscated from infidels, is also subject to a 20% tax. ISIS also engages in kidnapping and ransom, primarily targeting foreigners or other high-value targets, as was the case of the American journalist James Foley, who ISIS held for ransom and later executed in 2013. In the past year, ISIS has raised over $125 million from kidnapping and ransom. ISIS is also involved in narcotics, the trafficking of Afghan heroin through its territory, with the annual value of this endeavor estimated to be potentially $2 billion. Ultimately, methods such as confiscation and looting provide one-off funding, a weakness accounted for by ISIS in a captured manual titled The Caliphate on the Path of Prophecy, in which the group outlined their plans for receiving property from religious minorities it had expelled and using it as seed capital for the caliphate. Confiscation of property was applied to the property of every single Shia, apostate, Christian, Yazidi, or other group based on a lawful order issued directly by the Ministry of the Judiciary, who, along with all other civil servants, were ordered back to work by ISIS, doing the same job as before, but under new restrictions and leadership. Thus, hundreds of former government employees were forced to collaborate with the ISIS regime. ISIS also exacted taxes from these Iraqi government officials, confiscating as much as half of their salary, as the Iraqi government continued to pay government wages for almost a year after ISIS took control of the city. ISIS likely netted at least $23 million in 2015 from taxes on government salaries in Mosul alone. Another form of taxation used by ISIS is called zakat, or an obligatory form of almsgiving in Islam, which requires Muslims to give 2.5% of their total assets as a religious tithe. ISIS justifies collection under the premise of fighting for a holy cause. While estimates for these taxes are difficult to conduct, investigations into captured ISIS documents reveal these taxes, surprisingly, garner the group more revenue than from oil. While oil fields may be bombed and property to confiscate or loot run out, agriculture provides ISIS a steady stream of cash, having captured extensive fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates River, which are important sources of food and water for the region. Furthermore, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization believes that 40% of Iraq's wheat-producing land is under ISIS control, which, if properly managed, is capable of producing crops worth possibly $200 million USD. In conclusion, understanding ISIS's financial practices in both formal and informal economies should be a priority in order to ensure long-term disruption of the group's means and networks of financing. While a US-led coalition against ISIS says 98% of territory once held by the group has been recaptured and liberated, the strategy and blueprint for their successful funding remains, as the Islamic State's capacity to govern occupied territory and maintain government institutions proves as dangerous as their combatants. ISIS will inevitably lose their occupied territory due to being surrounded by enemies, despite how well organized and effective their economic plan was. However, they will likely revert to their past form, a radical militant insurgency capable of violent and asymmetrical attacks at home and abroad. With its enormous amounts of accumulated capital from their years of extraction from the populations of Iraq and Syria, ISIS persists as a scary threat if the US and its coalition are incapable of countering this mix of bureaucracy and brutality within the economic sphere.